created from those public services may have a case for creating some sort of a public interest mutual or beneficial ownership. And UK, for example, has created this public service vehicle regulations through this Bus Services Act, where they have mandated that these private operators would share whatever data is available. So there is precedence, there is this logic or rationale about beneficial interest. However, our non-personal data committee has taken it a step too far by making it very, very expensive. You had asked me, Siddharth, about the basis of regulating non-personal data. I think this is twofold. One is there's public value in data, and therefore it's eminently helpful to create a framework for who gets access to what type of data and why. And that framework could be very helpful in determining how can this non-personal data thinking or regulation can be more specific to public value. And number two is to create the governance or the checks and balances around this notion of public interest, which can help unlock value from data for public interest. So I'll stop there, but just wanted to outline the notion of why data is unique, whether it's personal data or non-personal data, why collectively thinking about data gives us a very different notion of both value as well as rights and harms, and also why it makes sense to think about regulating non-personal.
Thanks, Sushant. I think there's a lot there, and we're definitely going to dive into a lot of those things right now. Malavika, if I could come to you next, I was wondering what, on similar lines, how you would kind of characterize, you could call it non-personal data, you could call it community data, you could go either of those two ways and kind of break that down depending on, I guess, where you want to derive the interpretation from. But I was wondering what you'd have to say on just how to conceptualize that and how to look at the body that we're trying to regulate here.
Sure. And like you said, there are many experts, even in the attendees list I see. So I'm hopefully not going to try and cover ground that we have in many of the previous discussions over the last 2 or 3 years in the personal data context. I think the reason we're all kind of sitting up and taking note right now is next week we have this deadline to respond to the committee around non-personal data. And I think this has really kind of opened up a can of worms in some sense, because of course, last year about this time, the committee was announced and there was thinking around what could be in that category, but I don't think we expected it to move as swiftly. At least I certainly on the outside in the research work didn't. So I think the two categories I'd like to kind of set up upfront is this personal data category and non-personal data category. I think fundamentally that's the kind of mental model that this report anyway is trying to create that distinction. And myself, obviously, my training is as a lawyer, but I work at interdisciplinary team right now. So I do apply some economics frameworks and some sociological frameworks as well. I think one thing we know, and I won't say again to this audience, as Sushant's already said, the property framework really breaks down when you try and apply it to personal data, especially in India post-Puttaswamy, because there's a very clear personhood interest. And so, there's this kind of spectrum, nothing's binary, it's all a spectrum. So there's this kind of spectrum between personhood, autonomy, liberty, right? Like if you restrain someone's data and you don't allow data portability, is that actually a civil liberties issue? Like that's a very real question in a world where most of our welfare delivery right now, for instance, is digitizing. And then all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you do have this idea, for instance, that maybe in certain cases, there is a role for the state to open up certain data sets for public good, right? And both of these somehow seeming contradictions can exist if we, I think, take the conversation a little bit more granular, and then we think about categorizations that actually work through various iterations. So I think on the one hand, that's the kind of journey we've had with personal data. The reason I did that little recap of like personhood, I don't know, intellectual property, moral rights, there are all these kinds of legal frameworks that people are trying to conceptualize data through. And then we suddenly have this new NPD where very clearly in the report, at least in India, we have said things like natural resource and public infrastructure, for instance. I must say quite upfront, I'm not very clear whether this is a logically consistent category that you can cut away entirely from personal data. I think in our own work and kind of a lot of the literature we've been looking at, fundamentally the majority of data sets are mixed data sets. Not merely because there's a question of identifiability when it's kind of human and then anonymized data, but even for IoT type data or traffic data, there's relatedness to human beings that therefore arises, right? So you may not have collected the information from me, but from that information you could glean something related to me. So the concept of when does data start mattering to personal sort of privacy, to privacy of an individual, is really quite a complex one. And I think where the majority of the world is falling is that it's very hard to get this completely pure, non-human NPD of sorts. And therefore, I really wonder, is this kind of an over-engineered solution really to a problem that's fundamentally always, at least for me, it's going to start with the individual. And I think the other thing I will say, and this is a step away from the frameworks a little bit, I do understand a lot of the kind of discomforts and motivations driving this report. I think there's a general acknowledgement globally that, there is a kind of harvesting of value, perhaps, from certain actors to certain other actors, and individuals or communities aren't getting their fair share. And definitely there's this kind of, I'll just call it out, the elephant in the room is the kind of global south, global north tension in international sort of trade and so on. And those are all very good motivations, right? Like if an Indian government feels that, we are the second biggest consumer base and soon to be the biggest consumers of data, and not necessarily our companies are getting the upside of that, or our consumers. That's all very well. I think my discomfort with this framework or talking about these conceptual categories is I think all of those issues can actually be dealt with by an extension of our competition law, for instance, an extension of our intellectual property regime. And even though we have international obligations in that regard, there is enough movement. And I actually think even in our personal data protection bill, there's actually a lot we could do there to accommodate ideas of group privacy or collective privacy. There is a definition of harm, which I don't like, but there's something you could work with in these existing frameworks. So I think the big question in my mind now, as we get closer and closer to actually submitting a response, sorry to make it very tactical and sound like a university student, but I think the big question in my mind is really what is the underlying motivation here? Because when I peel it back, most of those motivations, whether it's innovation, incentivizing innovation, opening up kind of data for public good, or harms, for privacy harms, all of those, into my mind, sit within other existing frameworks. And that's why I think that's another kind of tactical reason why I'm finding it quite hard to kind of get on board with the whole nomenclature around NPD in India, at least.
That's definitely interesting, and I want to especially come back to that on the bits about harm and of innovation, how we look at that, because I think that's part of the question of this whole question of value that we see in non-personal data in that sense. I think kind of building off some of what you said, Malavika, I'd like to come to you, Richard, to kind of look at how this question of the value of non-personal data and in that sense interfaces with the whole fiduciary concept and how we look at that within the framing of non-personal data and how we look at that body in that sense.
Great. Well, thank you. And hi, everybody, and greetings from Silicon Valley. I can say that the theology that data is the new oil is very much alive and well here, despite its many detractors over the past number of years. And I think Malavika hit it on the head, right? Reality is a continuum, and human concepts tend not to be. And so I think why we're wrestling with data, as Sushant mentioned earlier, it is a very unique thing, or I would call it almost more process or organic substance. It's something that is very hard to get our arms around, almost like the internet itself, right? What is the internet? What is data? And so to me, it is this really interesting blend of the personal and the environmental, the individual and the collective. It's relational, it's contextual, it's situational, and all of those aspects of it make it very difficult to grab onto sort of legalistic conceptions and nail it down and say, okay, this is what this is, here's what the rules of the road are going to look like. And yet we have done that anyway, largely because there are large companies and governments alike who benefit from creating concepts that they can then sort of determine what those ecosystems look like and who will be the winners and who will be the losers in the contest over, in this case, over data. So I just want to check just for a few minutes on some of the points that Sushant and Malavika already raised, and just focus on, as you mentioned, sort of this notion of fiduciaries. Data, because it is relational, because it is something that is not necessarily a thing that exists, it's a bunch of digits that are sort of capturing reality. In Silicon Valley and in Wall Street, I can tell you data is transactional. It is a one-off. It's a way of gaining value. And you can call it whatever kind of economic good you want to call it. Some have called it labor, capital, a private good, a public good. Ultimately, it is a thing from which you derive economic value. And so that is what has been driving policy around the world. It's what I think is still behind things like GDPR in Europe and data protection laws here in California and being debated in the US Congress. That conception still is very much alive and well. And so one of my pushbacks here is to say, well, no, I think data is actually something that's more relational between individuals, even within individuals, frankly, but also between individuals and their environment and their communities. And if you just shift that focus, that mind frame, it takes you away from many of the preconceptions around the economics of data. And you start to think about, okay, whatever this thing is, how do we come up with sort of human institutions, human governance structures to deal with it? And so property rights is sort of the way we tend to have done this in the past, as sort of the legal framing. And then the governance structure is usually either market, a pure market environment, or a government. And those are the two poles. And I don't know if Eleanor Ostrom's name has come up yet in today's conversations earlier, but she of course has talked about the third way, which is the commons. And she has a great phrase, I think she calls the monocentric hierarchies, is what she calls markets and governments. So I think the commons and the way that we've looked at natural resources and other sort of shared resources in the human context is another framing that I think is interesting to look at for something that may be a better match for the thing that we were talking about when we were discussing data. And that's what gets me to the world of fiduciaries. Fiduciary law, the common law, much of this comes from Europe and the UK, but frankly, the concepts of sort of dealing with power asymmetries between people is near universal, whatever you call it. There are rules, there are regulations, norms, in some cases, practices to deal with situations, relationships where one person has power over another. Maybe it gets superior expertise, superior knowledge. They have confidences that that has been shared with them that needs to be protected. So the duty of care, the duty of loyalty is also embedded in professions like attorneys, doctors, lawyers, financial advisors, and the like. But at the root of it, the fiduciary law is a relational law. It is about human relationship. And so the underlying thing we're talking about almost is secondary. Whether it is a good, oftentimes it is not a good. It could be an element of your health or your financial well-being or whatever it might be. That's secondary to the notion of having a protective and relationship where your interests are promoted. And so coming back to our conversation here, I feel like thinking about data not as a thing, but as a flow of experience, human and otherwise, and that then putting the relational context on top of that opens up different vistas that frankly we haven't really, I think, explored well enough so far as a society. And then the one other piece I'll just mention before I turn back to you, Siddharth, is the NPD conversation is interesting to me in one sense because you're taking two things that I think are quite disparate and you're jamming them together. So one is personal data that has been anonymized, right? And that's sort of the one bucket that people often point to. And then the other is sort of environmental-ish type data that doesn't have any sort of origin in the individual. Those are two different things. And just because something's been anonymized, for example, doesn't mean it can't be re-anonymized. And so the very sensitivities and risks around that data being made available are very much there. Technology is the only thing standing between you and having that data being opened up for other non-personal purposes. And and yet it's been put in that same category. So to me, I call it, the notion I've come up with is sort of, it's non-personal by design. That's what that category would be. And then non-personal by nature or inherently is more the data in the bucket of things coming out of the environment. And if you think about it in that context alone, it takes you, I think, down two different paths in terms of the risks, in terms of the desire to protect certain aspects of that from the perspective of society. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Richard. I think there's some great points in there, which I think one of I'm going to bring up right now to go to Malavika. I think Malavika, while speaking about the dangers of this classification, you kind of pointed out how, for example, there are some interesting things regarding the personal data protection bill, which might help with how to kind of protect against this. Sort of protects against the harms that we see from using non-personal data, and how, I guess, a trusted entity is required there in terms of who's taking care of it. But do you see? Do you have any kind of other ideas from what the NPD proposes, I guess, on how to have someone protect against this harm?
Yeah, well, I guess that there are a couple of things in there. I mean, on the first point regarding the category itself, I think the one thing that I definitely do agree, and I maybe pick up where Richard left off, is this idea of contextual use of data really driving, I think, what regulations would look like. And so I think the one thing that we've been trying to get the conversation going on, and I think to varying degrees of success in the last couple of years, is just this idea of use-based regulation, right? So I think we have a predilection to try and ex ante determine XYZ things must be regulated in XYZ ways. So we really want to be very prescriptive and just give someone a chart and just say, if it looks like this, then do this. I think with data, it is, I think, especially personal data, I'll start with that. But honestly, like I said, these categories aren't so distinct in my head. I think it will require us to shift towards use-based regulation. So to start looking at the acts and at the point at which data is used in order to understand what is the appropriate data practice there. What is the appropriate kind of red lines that we come up with as a society? I think the thing again that where I've landed in my thinking and where my team at the Future of Finance Initiative, I think for us, where we've landed is kind of, we can learn a lot from existing frameworks to arrive at almost kind of a legitimacy test, which can be done much better than it's been done in other countries, which have been trying to move to this kind of more contextual approach, right? So rather than setting up saying, you know, this is sensitive personal data, this is personal data, this is NPD, and then do X, Y, and Z, really look at the context of use. And at that stage, decide if that usage is lawful and if it's necessary in order to provide the stated purpose. These are all tie back to very classical data protection principles, really. And then if you've passed those two tests, you need to get into this whole idea of proportionality. And I think that, in a sense, requires contextual, use-based understanding in order to arrive at, is this correct or not? And actually, I think a corollary to that is the only people who can ever really apply this test in my book or really make a call about whether the contextual use of data is right or wrong is the person using the data, right? And so I think this is where it requires a huge shift, because I think we are very used to kind of setting up a regulator who's going to come marching in and then just, you know, kind of do an inspection. I think the reality of the fact is it's only you need to embed accountability at the level of the data processes itself, whether that's at the level of the, you know, kind of ML engine itself, when programmers or developers are writing their algorithms up. I think that's where the accountability needs to be driven, and it needs to be conducted by the entity. In fact, so I would say this kind of test of legitimate purpose would be applied by the entity itself that is managing the data. And I think then it comes to your question of then how do you build up accountability? So one proposition I've made for you is that we need to have a contextual use-based test to see if data is being used according to its stated purpose, whether that's non-personal, whether that's personal, and so on. I think the other piece of this is then what is the accountability structure you're going to set up to audit that any of this is happening, that it's not being abused, that people aren't hoarding data. So a large preoccupation of this report is really this idea that there are a few firms who have a lot of data and it needs to be opened up. My experience of reality is that's not I mean, that is the case, but I think there are ways we can get around it. In the data context, I think this really requires accountability mechanisms um, that use both regulation and use technology. And over here, I guess the big question is really, do we need an intermediary who will report to the regulator and then also speak to the data fiduciaries or custodians or what have you? I must say on this, I don't really have, I don't know where I've landed. I know that there's a big movement which kind of pushes for information intermediaries, and maybe we can talk more about that. My own experience, I mean, in the financial sector, especially dealing with more vulnerable groups in the financial sector, is that intermediaries, if they're not designed well, have a lot of incentives that are not often aligned with the data principles. So it's all very well, as a lawyer, obviously, I have fiduciary duties myself, but there are many lawyers, you kind of swear an oath, and that doesn't mean that you're always going to act in the best interests unless you have a clear mechanism that actually tracks that. So I feel, especially given our experience in the financial sector lately, in the last crisis, we've tried a few kind of re-engineering of how can you set up an intermediary system that doesn't fall foul to the power asymmetries that do exist. And I think that's something that requires a lot more thinking. I think the revenue stream will be incredibly important. And I think the other kinds of accountabilities and regulatory mechanisms for something like that to work will really need to be important. I think an alternative, if we stepped outside intermediaries, is really to have a kind of reg tech driven system where if you do have very tech enabled firms, if they're able to be so tech enabled internally, surely they can be tech enabled to the regulator, right? I mean, we are doing this again, if you look at core banking systems and how reporting is done in the financial sector, often from the institutions directly through, dashboards. Can we think of something like that? So I think those are kind of two thoughts. So on the one hand, just kind of to your question about how do we actually think about regulating data use? And again, I've kind of stepped back from the non-personal data categorization there. And then the second one is kind of more tactically, what could that mean? It could mean intermediaries, but I think it could also just mean more tech-enabled regulator.
Thanks, Malavika. I think I want to kind of pick on something you mentioned there, and maybe Sushant, I think you would have some thoughts on this. Malavika mentioned a possible, I don't know, that we should look at a use-based test of some nature and look and see how it's being used and kind of build our regulatory view on that. How would you say? I guess I'd like to get your reaction to that, and maybe if you kind of differ on that in some way, I'd be happy to hear that as well, of how you think we should look at, I don't know, framing that question of at which point to regulate that.
Oh, sure. You will not be pleased to hear that I don't disagree with Malavika at all. But I just put a nuance to it, which is based on my understanding of what we are trying to achieve with the thinking around the non-personal data. Just to sum it up, in terms of how the definitions have been put out, I do think it's a step in the right direction. The reason is we don't have a taxonomical reference when it comes to non-personal data, and leave aside some sort of a definitive taxonomical reference. We don't even have a starting point for discussion. So I think it's good that a reference point has been put in public domain, and we will have our discussions on it and kind of make progress. I'm veering more towards the view of this panel, which talks about how there are two distinct sets here. One is which is environmental data, and the other which is linked in some way to personal data in itself. And I think the non-personal data report kind of exceeds its brief in both thinking about the anonymized personal data in the same vein as sort of an environmental data, and kind of applying the similar yardsticks to how that data would be made available. It also makes a leap of faith in terms of technological solutions that will ensure would not be the case. And last, I think the notion of trust that was being discussed, or the governance that was being discussed, it has been again, it's again a leap of faith, which says there will be trusts which will have fiduciary duties, and they will magically fix any sort of governance issues over there. So just to step back and summarize it, I think in terms of contextual thinking on non-personal data, the problem to solve is for public interest, which is how do we make more data sets available for public interest or public good, which are environmental data sets in nature, and therefore do not lend itself to, say, individual collective harms. And solving for that would have to be contextual. It will have to be specific and not a broad brush approach, which encompasses not just data sets which are anonymized personal data, but also environmental data sets. So my suggestion or recommendation there would be to make these public interest definitions more contextual, more specific, and address them upfront. I also want to highlight, this is again a point about the report itself, that for creating public infrastructure, a private investment which has already been made, if it is appropriated, will create unnecessary disincentives and distortions in the incentive structures of the market. And therefore, in setups which have a licensing regime, for example, transport, for example, telecom, there it might be more, I guess, practical to think about the context in which a non-personal data can be regulated and regulated with good outcomes.
Thanks, Sushant. I partly taking off from what you've been talking about, but also going back to something Richard mentioned earlier. I want to pick on the question of who's doing this this caretaking in that sense, right? Who's doing this task of stewardship, and how you build trust in that sense, because the idea of trust in protecting individual articulated rights over personal data is, I think, straightforward to us to some degree at this point. I'm wondering how that interfaces with the question of public interest, with public value. I mean, is it only the confines of the state that's supposed to do it? Can somebody else do it? I would be curious to hear what you have to say on that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I could just and briefly touch back what Malavika said, I think there's an interesting way of looking at, again, these flows of data. There's sort of data at the origin, what I call the origin points, or upstream, right? And that's where a lot of the context comes in. You know, where is it coming from, in what situation? And then some of the risk factors are attendant to that. And then there's the downstream uses. What are the purposes of utilizing that data once it's been gathered, collected, et cetera? And so I think if you define access rights, access at both layers in a sense, access at the origin point and access at sort of the subsequent purposing or repurposing stage, that might be one way to think about it. And there's also sort of question, if I could just quickly address in the Q&A, this question about the fiduciaries, before I come back to yours. How do we make sure that they stay sound, that they are in fact, that they're not captured in some way? I think there are a number of answers to that. One is there are a number of fiduciary duties. The most common one, often cited in statutes particularly, is the duty of care. The duty of care really basically says do no harm and act prudently. And I think that's actually a fairly low bar. I used to say when Google would walk around saying don't be evil, people thought, oh my gosh, that's what an amazing thing for any modern American company to say. And my response is, yeah, but if you're basically saying don't be the Darth Vader of the internet, that's good enough. I mean, that just seems like such a low bar. So the duty of loyalty is the thing that really is the higher standard, and that says no conflicts of interest and promote the best interests of the client, customer, patron, et cetera, whatever the situation is. So I think having a duty of loyalty for starters is one place to go. A second is there should be an easy out for the end user or the client in this case. They should be able to withdraw those access rights immediately if there's a question, concern around whether or not the fiduciary in that context is doing something that is anathema to their interests, that those access rights go away, and therefore their ability for that entity to continue that relationship is gone. And if data is localized, right, so the data is not sitting in a pool someplace or on a server farm halfway around the world, but actually stays with the individual, when the rights go away, therefore the entity, at least if they're operating under what the law would require, and I'm thinking about, they would have no further access to the data. They wouldn't have a copy in a file someplace sitting that they could utilize. And then the third piece is then professionalizing. This has to be something where there's strong compliance regime, enforcement regime. The government has to be part of that in some ways. Maybe there's some licensing involved, but there would have to be a heightened set of duties with a compliance aspect to that as well. And then I apologize. What was the question you asked me originally?
My question was how these, these fiduciaries and I use the term a bit loosely here, can account for these purposes of public value and for public good.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So that's one of the interesting things. If you have a fiduciary, another form of that based on similar law is a trust, right? So you have a board of trustees and a trust. That could be, again, it could be around goods or services, but it could also be around a piece of property. There are many trusts in the environmental space where people have land in trust, and the trustees are in control of that, make decisions on behalf of that, and essentially are stewards of that environment. So I think you could use that as one of the ways, mechanisms to sort of instantiate the fiduciary obligations. But then I would go back to Elinor Ostrom. I mean, she didn't win a Nobel Prize for nothing. I think she had some really keen insights on communities that can govern themselves. So don't necessarily have to say it's either pure public or pure private. One of the great things about commons governance is it can be a mix of both. And the community itself, however that community defines itself, can come up with the implements that sort of match up to the things that they're trying to accomplish.
Thanks, Richard. Malavika, you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to come in on a couple of things, and maybe it's a question for both Sushant and Richard and yourself as well to that. But I think, so a couple of things that strike me when I'm looking at this non-personal data debate as well, is firstly, the idea that, say, communities have rights. And of course, that makes sense. I'm just thinking in the context of, especially big data algorithms. One thing that we know, for instance, is that the person might not be even aware that they are a member of a community that has been identified through inferences, right? So this is one of the big conundrums of this thing. Like, how can you have a community, like you may have a right potentially, and there may be a community data right or something like this, but you may not, I might never be aware of how I've been classified or categorized under, somebody else's, it's happening because of a data set somewhere that I might not even be aware that I'm part of. Now, given this conundrum, I'm not quite sure. It works in a kind of analog world where there has been almost a self-awareness and a self-articulation of the notion of community. But I think when we think about it in this context, it's not necessarily as organic. So I think some of these analogies that have come into tribal forest rights and so on, I really worry about those analogies, but I'm not sure that they translate at all, if at all, to the digital world. I think the other thing on the trust structure, I mean, though, of course, I do think it's an interesting move to try and decentralize power away from just the data fiduciary, as it were. One thing that I think we've been struggling with in relation to the data trusts, certainly as they appear in this report, is that in some sense, their role mainly seems to be in relation to sharing the community's personal data. My understanding is it not really has any rights vis-a-vis the data trusts themselves. So the data trustee per se is just identified as a body that can transact with whoever it is regarding a pool of data, which, I'm not even sure how much the community knows that they're in that pool, for starters. Secondly, the data trustee does not seem to have any rights vis-a-vis the data trust. Like, I would have loved to see a really brave out there more. Like, there's so much out that's in this report that's so out there. They could have just added in like a revenue stream back into the data that the data trustee decides where it goes. For instance, I mean, if we really wanted to be far out. But I think it's unclear to me how this is empowering communities necessarily. And the great thing about being in India is we have like 3-4 decades now of really good participatory governance development models. In any field, you take any analogous field, you will probably see a whole range of places where it's worked and places where it hasn't worked when it comes to participatory governance. But we don't see much of that here. Unfortunately, the cynic in me just sees structuring that enables a data flow quite effectively from a demarcated community. And then I see the, trustees themselves could be ministries, for instance. I don't see how that's actually very different from a standard property-based regime, where you do just kind of enable in certain cases, quite serious things like expropriation or eminent domain, which we do have in India and which does stand. But as we've discussed, that's not logically consistent with I think, data as a whole, especially post-Puttaswamy. So I think there's something around community data and something around data trustees, where in this context, the way it's been imagined, I'm not quite sure that's actually going to be in the best interests of the citizen or the consumer themselves.
Now, I want to take a quick stab at it and then get back to the show. Again, on communities, I do think the thinking around the intersections of the communities or the continuum of communities, or even whether communities identify themselves as communities or who will identify these communities. I think these are important questions. At the same time, which I honestly don't have answers to. But at the same time, I do feel like when it comes to collective harm or thinking about baking in provisions which prevent some of these collective harms and provide a recourse for a community to not be discriminated, the notion of thinking about this community data could be helpful. Now, I would leave it to the lawyers to figure out how it can be made practical and implementable. But it does appeal to me when I think of the conceptual notion of collective harms to a community. Although, there's a lot more that needs to be thought about in terms of intersections and how it transcends. The second bit, I think, is on the economic rights. And this goes back to the initial points we had made as to why do we need something like this? Why do we need to kind of put a stake in the ground for non-personal data? We need to for two reasons. One, we spoke about this, public interest. And two, how can we make sure that, say, data hoarding by private corporations by virtue of ensuring that they have put in private investments, how can we make sure that there is some key that helps unlock that? And therefore, the notion of community having rights to particular data sets because they are a source of it does appeal to me, at least in theory. I'm honestly not sure how it will translate into practical outcomes. Over to you, Richard.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Sushant. Those are good questions. Yeah, the notion of the community self-identifying. I guess there could be a regime I can imagine where the government says, if a community self-identifies, then we're going to essentially recognize your access rights, let's just say. And maybe there's some criteria where there's some sort of relatively democratic process where the community can speak for itself. And there's an obvious understanding that they have access to that data set, whatever it is that happens to, whether it's a community of interest or a geographic community or whatever. So there may be some way that the self-identification can be blessed by a third-party government body, for example, that then the rights sort of imbue in that context. And then I was going to say, there are interesting examples I can think of. One of the other things I think that's unfortunate from the India draft, there are many really fascinating things in there, but it does focus so much on the economic rights, and there's so much else in the world that is not economic, but still provides tremendous value to people. So so how do you tap into that? Not necessarily as a source of wealth, but as a source of improvement, of creativity, of innovation, of ways of people expressing themselves, of ways of gleaning insights from things happening around them that don't necessarily become part of that sort of pecuniary system. And I would have liked to have seen a broader vision around, how the thinking of data in that context provides people with ways of improving their lives. And I think that would be, to me, a more uplifting approach than to simply focus on the economic rights. And then the last piece I would just say is, then the other counterweight, the only counterweight seems to be individual privacy. And as long as individual privacy isn't violated, then we're probably okay. And coming back to something Malavika said, I think there's some real concerns about market power, competition issues that go well beyond individual privacy. And so to the extent that people own and control access to non-personal data, and they have market power, that probably deserves its own separate treatment from what, the analysis that's provided at least in the India Committee report.
I think all three of you seem to be circling around the document at this point, so I'd like to dive in a bit deeper. If I could ask, if I could actually direct this at all three of you, and I'm happy to hear different takes on this, but your discomfort, I'd like to hear more about your discomforts on the kind of ambitions of the policy, because I think both of you, or maybe all three of you, mentioned that there may be better solutions for what the policy is trying to do, because there may be other avenues, maybe antitrust, maybe some of the other avenues Richard was mentioning just now. But I'd like you to maybe express your discomfort with these ambitions of the policy a bit more. Sushant, Malavika?
Yeah, I'll again take a quick stab at it. I think this is, I've said many times, it is a leap of faith that this report takes. And it prescribes solutions which are far too coercive in terms of, and far too disruptive to the current context. And I don't think that the committee actually is expecting some of these recommendations to be implemented in the next 3 to 4, 5, even 10 years. And therefore, it's sort of making, I guess, progress in terms of thinking. Unfortunately, I feel that the ideological grounding that is necessary to advance that thinking is completely missing. So whether it's based on the thinking of, say, the inherent thinking about the value of data, or the thinking about what's the right legal framework to think about data, I think all of this is completely missing, and that's my big sort of problem or discomfort with this approach. Tries to solve for some problems, but takes a very expansive, coercive approach. The second thing, again, I've mentioned this earlier, but I think it takes a very technocratic approach to data governance, where a lot of emphasis is placed on creating this platform where metadata will be shared by all data businesses, and somehow magically, we will be able to have data audits and be able to, the regulator will be able to enable and enforce. Just to me, I'm calling it a leap of faith, but we could even call it a shot in the dark, because there's no evidence to back up either the assumptions or even the solutions.
Malavika?
I can go next. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, we always talk about how government is a many-headed beast. Just like we talk about data and we say we have to disaggregate, we can't just say data. I think similarly, there's government. What's interesting to me in this report, coming so close on the heels and almost parallel to the Personal Data Protection Committee, is it's the same ministry. But in many ways, I'm trying to understand the interplay between the two. So I think one of my discomforts here is the fact that we're erecting two data regulation frameworks, which are not necessarily interlinked. I think there must have been something that created Section 91 and 92 of the PDP bill that many of us have followed. Suddenly this, in the penultimate draft, in the draft introduced to Parliament, you see a completely new clause that hadn't been publicly seen before, which says NPD can also be asked for under this bill. So clearly, I think some of this, there is there is the politicization of this, which is behind the scenes, and that's not a bad thing. I actually think politicization is not always a bad thing. I think it's good because it gets communities involved. It kind of helps people understand their stake in a lawmaking process. Just on the NPD side, I think my discomfort is that once you have two regimes, what can happen is that you can have this potential for kind of almost regulatory arbitrage, because you're basically giving the firm a choice of whether they want to be a data custodian under, or a data business under this regime, and a data fiduciary under the PDP bill. And that's something that really concerns me. So I feel like the kind of in the crossfire of, I don't know what kind, whether it's a regulatory turf war or what exactly the machinations are behind the veil. But I think the outcome may not, again, be as good for even government or kind of the public interest or individuals, because you essentially kind of have the situation where you are kind of encouraging bookkeeping in data, which I think when we started this entire process, I think when in the coming of age of the last 10 years, we've had all this digitization. I think one thing that's become clear is finally we need to take data practices seriously in this country. Like finally we can't make that argument like Indians don't care about privacy, right? When like now identity theft is real, fraud is real, you know, these very tangible manifestations of privacy harms are real. And I think my main discomfort here is clearly there a lot of the assumptions on which this is based. This are essentially to do with the thread that there's economic value being harvested, which somehow is being harvested away from places where it should be. And I, for one, think that, as I said before, the PDP bill, the competition law, and potentially intellectual property frameworks, or even national security frameworks, could deal with a lot of these discomforts. I think the other thing I will say, if those weren't enough discomforts, I think that the thing I would love to see, if there is going to be a second draft, and some people say there will be, is to really call out the assumptions underlying some of the leaps from the motivation to the proposal. So like this idea that you know, data is priceable. Like there is not, I fundamentally think there are non-price aspects of data that are more determinative of benefit or harm. And I think we discussed this before. And there is just, I think this is very hard-nosed kind of economic value must be extracted and diverted in some sense. I think this idea that, you know, at no cost, I think it says at no remuneration in some stage. This is raised, I know in many quarters, this idea of, you know, it's a country with eminent domain, so which is successful. And I think there is a big concern there that you might have the opposite effect on innovation and the opposite effect on community data rights. So I think one way to immediately just diffuse all the, you know, the kind of fears that such a document might raise would just to be like to call out some of those assumptions and maybe consult on that. And this is one thing I would really like to call out. I think Meity did a pretty good job with the previous committee. I mean, of course, there were lots of debates around that, but I feel like the white paper was a real white paper which raised foundational questions. So there was a moment 3 years ago where everyone sat down and really thought, you know, I'm going to put my foot forward here. What do I think about X? What do I think about the notion of a data principle, a data subject? I think we need something like that when it comes to non-price data, maybe have a wider conversation about, is there an economic value and plus other kinds of value for data? How would you articulate that? And then kind of move more gradually towards what are the objectives? Why, what can this solve for that is not already solved for? I think is one way to reconcile those discomforts.
Thanks, Malavika. That I do agree that a certain principle level conversation is definitely warranted. Richard, if I could come to you.
I want to do a plus one on Malavika's point that the report actually calls out, and this is from the report itself, it calls out that it's very difficult to place a value, cost, benefit on data. And the same vein says there will be a data marketplace that will determine the price of data. I think we can all wish ourselves good.
+2, yeah.
Thanks. I guess kind of almost countering the criticism in that sense, because my understanding would be that even if you kind of recognize this non-economic value of data, you still need a framework to kind of, I don't know, make it work for public good. So I guess my question.
Sorry, I meant to say, I'm sorry to like, I'm becoming too conversational at this stage. I'm forgetting this is the problem of having an event in your room, like in your study. But I mean, the one thing that I've not found too much in the conversation so far on this is that we already have the Right to Information Act, right? So there is, I think it's really important to keep transparency and public interest in having information data sets opened up. distinct from, we are already doing that in this country. We had an open data policy, we had the NDACP, didn't take off. So actually, I feel we have all the nuts and bolts. It would be great to seriously commit to open data for once, because those protocols are out there. Many countries are doing it. And I think we have a good shot at doing it. So that's just one thing I would like to say. I think one more discomfort is when we frame it like this is the only way we will ever exchange data sets. I think that's like, I think it's better to be a bit, kind of more, less sanguine about it, I think.
I wanted to, I guess, come to the theory discussion a little bit with Richard and ask about this harvesting of non-economic value of data and how that could look, and could it not, in theory, follow the same coercive patterns as we're doing right now under the discourse of redistributing economic value, or how would that look or work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I guess part of my answer would be we should leave it to the communities who are involved to figure out what value they derive from the data. It doesn't need to be some sort of centralized policy that somebody adopts and applies. And this conversation, frankly, reminds me a bit of what's going on in this notion of data monetization, right? And so, we have the platform companies and their ecosystems who are monetizing the heck out of personal data. And then there are people who are objecting to that. But part of some of the objectors and some of the most vociferous critics say, okay, that's a bad thing. We should be part of that too. And so we should be getting a benefit from monetizing data. So you should get your $7 check a month from Facebook. And it's like, okay, great. A check from Facebook is always welcome. But on the other hand, you're completely buying into the paradigm that you're critiquing. And so it just feels like there's a real disconnect there. And similarly here, I think we need to step back and understand that, data, once you get out of a monetization mindset, and just start thinking about data as almost like just life experience. What is the worth of life experience? Whether it's online, offline, my interactions, my thoughts and feelings, what shirt I want to buy next month, what vacation I might take next year. There's monetary value to somebody for that, but it's also intrinsic to our being human beings. And so I just feel like if we step back a bit, I don't have any ready answer for you, frankly, but I feel like just the step back alone, hopefully will invite conversations where we can start to think about what are the mechanisms where those kinds of values can be recognized by somebody and made a part of this sort of the larger, sort of this larger ecosystem.
Sushant, would you have some thoughts on that?
So I'd pick up on the thread of talking about data as an experience, which is, thanks to Richard, something very new to ponder on. But then also I think about the current state of data economy and how the data economy operates, and the inherent flaws that I see that exist with it. That doesn't account for data as a relational or contextual experience. It does look at it as a currency. It does look at it as a comparative differentiation. It does have the network effects. And I'm kind of going back to the problems that the report or look at in the non-personal data context. And those problems are very real. And the problems are related to the market power, the concentration of power, the concentration of profits, not paying taxes, very little recourse for individuals and communities on what happens with their data and how it is being used. Increasingly moving away from human agency and ability to control your own behavior online and being manipulated into something else. These are real issues and real problems. And I admit that we are now discussing more personal data in sort of the personal data bucket as a word. But I do, after all the discomfort that we mentioned and spoke about with the report, I do again want to harp back on some real problems with the data economy, both with respect to how value is being concentrated, how power is being concentrated, and how there is very little recourse to any harm that comes about, and how there are absolutely no mechanisms to think about public interest and public value that can come from data. That necessitates this conversation.
Thanks, Sushant. I think I want to pick up on what you mentioned about power being concentrated, and in some ways, this I think our conversations on non-personal data as well as this policy are about countering that centralization of power, and I think this is something we've been talking about throughout the discussion about in terms of just accountability mechanisms and the communities kind of deciding for themselves how to use their data. So uh, I would want to hear some thoughts on how this upstream accountability works in ways that don't require reinventing of the wheel in that sense. Richard, Malavika? Yeah.
Sure. I'll chip in quickly. So yeah, and actually the notion of accountability to me is sort of the same problem, which is you're trying to make the people who are currently conducting themselves in harmful fashion to individuals and societies harm you a little bit less than they did yesterday. And while that is a laudable goal, and I think there are many amazing people involved in those battles over creating more accountability for those institutions as they affect our lives, I'm more interested in how do you create the new ecosystem based on agency, human autonomy and agency, where the individual and individual community, so it's not just this hyper localized or hyper personalized approach, but where people and communities have a greater say and don't have to buy into the notion of what the sort of the predominant incumbents are doing, whether it's on the corporate side or even on the government side. How do you create that decentralization, which to me is where a lot of the value, both economic and other kinds of values, comes out. I've never seen a whole lot of amazing value come out of hyper centralized institutions. So anyway, so I maybe just responded to accountability there, because it's one of those things that I think is necessary but not sufficient in terms of really gaining value out of the sort of the data society.
And I mean, I don't know if, for my part, I don't know if you were looking for specific models, but there's an entire literature out there in terms of the actual community-based participatory approaches themselves. And, happy to share some links after. But I think a lot of this comes from the development literature, where obviously people have for years figured out that you can't just do this top-down kind of distribution of welfare, right? And I think we've come up with, for instance, I was just looking up the other day in a totally different context. There are states in India that do completely decentralized participatory budgeting, right, down to the Gram Sabha level, which is really fascinating to me. So that I think there are some tried and tested models there in terms of community participation. However, I think at a higher level, I think I'm not sure that is at all the right approach. I think to go back to what I started all this with, I just feel like with data, the visibility and the cognitive load for someone to actually take on this, in addition, in a post-pandemic India where we have some serious scarcity going on right now, the fact that someone's going to find all this time and money and bandwidth really to be sitting around managing their data for no immediate reason, I think is just, even if there was a monetary gain, I think there are all these studies, Acquisity has done all this work showing that, we just have this immediate gratification bias. So there are all these behavioral biases. So I think it's really a kind of, at some level, not fair in the data context to devolve it to such a degree that it's every individual for themselves, because that clearly has failed. But that's what we have now. Notice and consent has pretty much failed. And again, on that, I think the only discussion of consent in this paper is consent to anonymization. Even as a kind of consumer advocate, I couldn't, if you ask me, are you consenting to anonymize your data? I would generally say yes, because I think it's a good thing. I have no idea what then would happen with that data set. So I think one way to look at it maybe is to really, I'm actually quite a fan to some extent of kind of accountability-led models. So maybe there we are disagreeing and fulfilling Siddharth's kind of earlier prompts. I actually think, of course, I think if you had an empowered agency-seeking kind of digital world, that would be great. But in India, I think I'm very conscious that we have this digital divide that we're operating in. That means many people might be using, maybe kind of sophisticated users of technology, but only to a certain task level. I don't think the mental model of the internet as, many of us who have kind of grown up with it versus somebody who's using a geophone for the right time. Like you have to be conscious that it's not going to be the same mental model. And to give you an illustration, I've always wondered, even as an Indian, like the idea of a shopping cart. Like how many times have I taken a shopping cart and gone, but I know that when I go on the Amazon website, I have to click cart, right? I think the idea of supermarkets itself, like I don't know whether this reveals my age, but I think, I was fairly old by the time we actually had like carts in supermarkets in India. So I think if it's like that for somebody, who is like incredibly privileged in this society, then it's going to be really hard to take some of these kind of highly structured solutions and expect the person to be acting in line with them. Like I think if shareholder capitalism itself is failing, and there you have a very high entry, if someone finds shares in a company, they kind of fairly sophisticated user, but even there it's failed. So I think maybe that's why I have this interest in accountability models, because I think there the conversation is really between the regulator and the regulated entities. And I think that's not to say that every entity has to be regulated. I really liked where we were going with the PDP bill. I hope we still go there. There are various issues that are problematic there, but I think the idea, to go back to Richard's point, and that really rang a bell for me, is one, there you had, at least in the white paper and the final report, this reassertion of non-monetary value of data, and saying, irrespective of what you're doing with data, you must respect XYZ type of rights. You must act uberema fide in the best interests. You must, have these transparency obligations, irrespective of how you're using how you're monetizing. So trying to divorce the obligations a little bit from the monetary value. I kind of feel like what we've done with this is do exactly what you were talking about, Richard, which is when you then say, can I have like a check from Facebook? We've kind of walked right back into it. And we've said, actually, if we have a pricing framework and we'll give you this much money if you give us the data. I think we've somewhere taken one step forward, two steps back. So I think going back to the PDP framing of an accountability-led framework where you have a very responsive regulator that's tech-enabled, that's able to speak to data fiduciaries directly, and maybe you have intermediaries, maybe you have other things there to kind of make that a more trusted ecosystem, would be a much kind of better way to go. I think one of the papers that we wrote lately, I'm happy to talk about it if it's relevant to the discussion, is how we could embed some of those rules and kind of almost automate those rules themselves to create like a trusted ecosystem.
If I just clarify, so I'm not saying anything negative about accountability, just saying accountability and agency should be sort of working hand in hand in a sense. So absolutely critical, necessary stuff to have accountability regimes, but I also would like to see these agency regimes. And I agree with you, notice consent is completely broken. And ironically, GDPR adopted it in large measure because it wanted to give more agency to people. And yet all it does is overwhelm us, because for most of us, we're too busy. We don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. So that's where I feel like the fiduciary can step in. If you have an appropriate mechanism where people can have a trusted third party acting under a duty of loyalty, that can not only just sort of protect their interests, but also you mentioned the shopping cart. Why not create technology tools where my shopping cart goes to Amazon, not the other way around? And I project my terms of service into the web, and I have a personal AI and I have identity layer that protects me. So there's all these other kinds of elements of an ecosystem where the tech tools are at the edge of the network that can instantiate so this agency approach. So, but anyway, I just want to make sure to clarify. I think both are useful and necessary, and hopefully complementary.
Thanks, Richard.
Siddharth, I wanted to just come in on a point of disagreement, and then also wanted to highlight that there are a couple of questions addressed in the chat window, which you could address to us. So my point of disagreement is on the monetization of data versus value of data. So when we start talking about data monetization, we should not conflate it with the value of data, because in this data economy, value concentration is real. If we do not think about how value is created, how it's extracted, how it's distributed, then we would probably not get to the level of understanding of data economy that helps us move a few steps closer to normative answers to what are the best ways to regulate it, what are the best ways to think about public value from data. So just a slight disagreement on monetization versus value discussion, because I think very different.
Thanks, Sushant. This was an excellent discussion, and I'm just going to pick on some of the questions that we have here. I think some of these questions have already been dealt with to some degree, especially around participatory models and about fiduciaries. Um, and I want to kind of focus on. Okay, I think that there's a slight question here about personal data, about non-personal data sharing. The question of whether it has to be mandatory, or whether it is something that can be incentivized, and whether big tech will share data if there's a public interest motivation behind it. I think this question kind of is themed around what all of you have been talking about. This question of mandating versus incentivizing, and how you do that. If anyone wants to take that question, I'd be happy to hear it.
I can start very shortly. I think the intent is to identify public interest outcomes. So, for example, we want to cure cancer or we want to find a vaccine. Can data help us? If data can help us, can we ask Facebook for that data? Maybe out of the inherent goodness of their heart and Mark Zuckerberg's personal philanthropy, they may make it available. And these are hypothetical situations. So I think moving from this reliance on goodness of the heart of big tech players towards creating meaningful solutions for public interest, I think there's a bridge to cross. I don't believe, however, that the bridge is coercive. I don't believe that the bridge is all encompassing. It may be coercive in certain specific contexts where you are able to conduct that cost benefit analysis and figure out a way forward. The short answer, Siddharth, is there are contexts and specific public interest value where you may need a different approach. But in general, a coercive approach that distorts market incentives and innovation is not working.
There are a couple of questions here directed towards Malavika's comments. The first one is about what are some lessons we can learn from successful financial fiduciaries, or other fiduciaries in the financial sector, and also about what could a third category of data look like if we're not happy with these two these two simplistic buckets of personal and non-personal data, if you will.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think the first one you said was, is it more in terms of the intermediaries and how to structure them? So I think obviously there are many lessons that have come. I was thinking specifically in the context of credit rating agencies, though I don't know if that's a great analogy at all. I think that's what I mentioned. I think generally as a rule, it's very classic first principles economics from what I understand when you're thinking about incentives here. Is just obviously when there's an intermediary who is neither the originator of the data nor the person using it, there is the room for this kind of rent-seeking behavior to develop. And therefore there's also, given the power asymmetries, there are like moral hazards that could develop, especially as we know that in the world of data, your consumers or citizens are doubly kind of vulnerable, right? And when I think about our country again, like my concerns are that we don't really fit the customer prototype of a lot of other places, because it's not so linear that, when you make X money, you'll access technology, or you have a lot of formerly non-literate people who are very good users of technology, and the reverse. So I think for all these reasons, it's very hard when you're trying to structure that individual intermediary relationship and also the intermediary regulator relationship. I think, in terms of lessons, I will have a think, and maybe I should send a few links around. The few that I can automatically, sorry, my dog's barking in the background. He's angry that I'm sitting in here. The few that I can automatically think of, obviously in Rahul Mathan's paper with learned intermediaries, there's this idea of a data audit and auditing of the intermediaries itself. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but if you look at the world of, I think we have this new regulator, for instance, in India for financial intermediaries. It's called the NCFRA. I think it's the kind of audit and accounting office. It's a very new regulator, and they've actually given some great fines to even big four accounting firms, for instance. I mean, if you look again at the kind of what is in the aftermath of the banking crisis before COVID, some of the actions against credit rating agencies in India, ICRA, I think a lot of these were driven by actually, you have the regulator not just regulating the entities, but also regulating any intermediaries who are there. And then you have codes of conduct. And in accounting and auditing, obviously, they've gone and then felt the need for a separate regulator. So I think there is just this timeless question of who is to guard the guards themselves. I think that's something that often adding an intermediary means you will require an additional layer of governance for that intermediary. So it's just a hard question we can't get out of. The question from Ameya, I think, about the third category. I mean, I'm saying I don't even agree we need two categories. So I don't know. I'm kind of like a personal data regulation enthusiast. I feel like regulate that, protect individuals, and the rest, misuse of market power regulation, I think could. There's a lot of thinking on that. I would plug Catherine Kemp, who I'm a big fan of, one of our advisors. Excellent writing on misuse of market power in data markets, and the Australian ACCC, Consumer Competition Council, they had a digital platforms inquiry, which was exactly on this, is how are digital platforms concentrating data power, and how can you put in certain mechanisms to ensure that competition doesn't happen, innovation goes up. So I feel like we need just one category and better competition law, maybe.
Could I put that question to you as well, Richard? Actually, both of those questions, if you will, on...
Yeah. For sure. So I guess I would also, I agree that there are some lessons to be learned from a number of sectors where we have existing fiduciary type obligations. I guess one of my pushbacks here, though, is it shouldn't just be focused on the data. Once we say, oh, it's a data fiduciary, then we're basically buying back into the same old paradigm, which is this is a good, this is a service, it's a form of labor, it's a transaction, it's a commodity, and somebody is helping you protect it, maybe use it a little better than they would have. So the term I tend to use is digital fiduciary because it's about a relationship. So it's not just about data. It's about maybe user-generated content that's coming at you online. It's all your interactions with the web on a daily basis. It's going to be increasingly IoT space we're walking around in when devices are trying to capture data, but use it for various purposes. And how do you push back on that? So a digital fiduciary to me is also more consistent with the idea of many of the professions where we do have fiduciary obligations, but it's not just about the specific thing. It is about, how do we make somebody better? How do we improve your health? It's not just solving the illness. How do we make sure that you are well and that your health is optimal if you're a doctor, for example? So anyways, that's sort of the context I would suggest as we think about it in that digital, as digital. And I tend to agree with Malavika. I think it's once you start to get out of the personal data area, it becomes pretty fraught. And an example I'll use is the world of agriculture. We have now starting to see some conflicts here in the United States, at least, where farmers have their farms, and now we have people coming along getting access to the data about the farms, from soil samples to using drones to figure out various things happening there, and they're selling that data to third parties, and third parties are using that to leverage, among other things, against that very farmer from whom the data is being extracted. Is that a privacy issue? Probably not. I don't think your row of corn is part of your privacy profile. But there's obviously market power and power asymmetry issues embedded in that particular situation. And those are the kinds of things I think would take us out of the PII world and into a context of trying to figure out how do we ensure that people getting access to that kind of information and knowledge are not getting it in ways that are sort of beyond the pale, but also using it, ironically, against the very people from whom they're extracting it in the first place.
Yes, and Richard, interestingly, this exact example has been quoted in the non-personal data report, where it talks about how drones would capture data from the farmers' fields and things like that, and then they would be able to sell it. What the report does is make sure that this data is then shared with anyone and everyone who asks for it. So it's all important, and potentially starts the conversation around the source of data or the beneficial ownership. So if this farmers' community is a source of data, and therefore it has some economic rights over that data. Now, I don't know how it solves the problem of harm that you spoke about, but it does kind of reference this issue. Now, this takes me back to the same point which we've started with, as to what are these principles, what are these sort of conversations on these normative questions that we need to have, which will help us get closer to an answer. I think those principles, that ideological foundation has been left unaddressed, and that's a conversation worth, not just worth having, but worth starting off.
Thanks, Sushant. There's one question, if someone can answer it quickly. It's about how do we prevent capture? It's addressed to Richard, sorry. The NPD mentions data trusts, which are basically trust intermediaries that you describe. How do you prevent that capture? And I think we've gone around this a little bit of how to work accountability such that this doesn't happen. But if you want to take a final crack at it.
Well, yeah, I saw that popped up early in the Q&A, so I tried to address it in an earlier response.
Oh, great.
But yeah, it's basically having heightened duties of loyalty, make sure that there is professionalization in a sense, give early out recourse for the users, and then create a regime of enforcement and compliance that has strong government backing.
Richard, I have a question, related question on data trust, which is, how do you think of data trusts existing, or this fiduciary responsibilities existing in contexts where the state capacity or jurisprudence is less developed compared to, say, other jurisdictions? Is that a distinction worth making? And I'm not a lawyer, so happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sushant. And in my research, and I must confess I don't know about every possible jurisprudence system around the world, but my understanding is that the concept of sort of this fiduciary, this power asymmetry, and the rights and obligations that come when one entity or person has it over another is fairly consistently dealt with within the laws and norms of different societies, but it's called different things. So what we may call a trust, because it comes from a certain legal context, may be called something very different someplace else. So yeah, and I also don't believe the trust as a legal mechanism is the answer and end all to be all to everything. But I think it is at least a useful jumping off point. And so I think we need to be obviously sensitive to whatever the laws, practices, norms are in different communities around dealing with power asymmetries. And hopefully those can be the starting point in those conversations with those folks.
Great. I think this has been an excellent discussion. Thank you to all three of the panelists for some great inputs, wide variety of opinions, wide variety of topics that we've covered today. I think this has been excellent. I look forward to seeing all of your outputs on these topics further as well. Hopefully Aapti will engage with you as well on these topics further, and we can see where these ideas go and where the policies go as well. Thank you for everyone who joined as well. Thank you to all our panelists for your precious time, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.